All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the New Books in Music, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. My name is Alex Kuchma, the host of the channel, and today I'll be talking to Geoff Harkness about his new book, DVS Mindz, the 20-year saga of the greatest rap group to almost make it out of Kansas. Geoff Harkness, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I followed your career for a little bit of time. I've read some of the other work that you've done in the Chicago hip hop, kind of underground hip hop scene, and it was a blessing to be able to get my hands on this and to kind of dive into this material with a little bit more depth. So yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Appreciate you having me here.
I wonder if you could begin the interview by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I was born in Lawrence, Kansas. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and lived there, until I was 15 years old. I grew up working in a record store. When I was 13, I got a job there, learned all about music. I played in bands, in punk bands and metal bands in Kansas City when I was 15. Went to lots of concerts. My mom was into concert promotion, got into concert promotion. And so I spent some years, hanging out backstage at concerts and meeting musicians. So I was very immersed into the world of music from an early age, from my early teenage years. When I was 17 years old, I dropped out of high school and moved to Los Angeles with my band. And we were destined to make it in the California music scene. I spent 4 years living in Los Angeles, and during that time, the band didn't make it, but I worked in record stores in Los Angeles from 1988 until 1992. And that was an incredible time to be working at a record store in Southern California. I really got into hip hop at that time, although I'd been working in record stores and obviously very into music, for much of my life. But living in Los Angeles really was transformative because that was such a great period for hip hop music, for rap music, and just being right there in the heart of all of it was an amazing experience to be, actually there, as those records are coming out, going to see the concerts and it was a great time for music and really fun, very transformative. So then I ultimately moved back home to go to college, and here I am today. That's a whole other story.
The Los Angeles scene, was it hip hop that you were interested then? I assume the band was not.
Yeah, well, actually, I was recording, demos with hip hop musicians when I was 18 years old, doing all the instrumentals and producing the tracks, with collaborating with rappers. So, it was always around. My band was not, necessarily playing rap music, but working at the record store, I got introduced, right as it's coming out to NWA, to Cypress Hill, to Digital Underground, to Kid Frost, all of the, this great stuff that was coming out at that time. And, by the time I was probably 20, 21 years old, I was at that time listening to almost nothing but, rap music. And, at that time there was all the grunge stuff was coming out, which was great music too. And, bands like Rage Against the Machine, I think I saw their 10th show or something before they were signed. I mean, it was just such a cool time to be there.
That's amazing. So how did you end up coming to write the book on DVS Mindz?
So when I was I was going to the University of Kansas and finishing up there, I got my first job out of college, which was as a music journalist. And at the same time I started that job, I was going to KU as a graduate student. So I'm kind of doing two things. One is I'm a sociologist and I'm doing, sociological research. And then my part-time job, is to write about music and to interview bands and go to concerts and stuff like that. So it's a great period and really fun. So I was assigned to write a concert review of U-God, who's a member of the Wu-Tang Clan. I was going to review his show, and I went to the show, and the opening band is this act, DVS Mindz, and I just thought that they were amazing. And I wrote a review basically, saying that DVS Mindz had blown U-God off the stage. It turns out DVS Mindz was this band from Topeka, just down the road, and I ended up doing a feature story about them, one of the first sort of substantial features that was written about them. And because I was going to graduate school and I was starting to make this documentary film as part of the graduate thing that I was doing, I ended up making a music video with them. And it was their first music video, and I had never done anything like that either. But we did a video for their song Tired of Talking, and it looked really cool. It turned out to be great. And we continued to sort of collaborate together and work together. And eventually, because I was making a documentary films at the time, we said, let's make a documentary about you guys. So we did a documentary film about DVS Mindz, and I interviewed everybody in the band, and I interviewed their manager and their fans and their friends. And I was already going to their shows. I was a fan of theirs and going to their shows and videotaping their shows. So we incorporated that footage and, ended up making a 2-hour documentary about the band. So it was, I was never really thrilled with that documentary. I thought it was, the interviews were cool. We did good stuff, but I didn't think it was like a great documentary. It was more like, we were thinking of it as more of a promotional piece, like an electronic press kit or something like that. So it never kind of went anywhere. The band faded away. I ended up moving to Chicago to go to graduate school. And in Chicago, I ended up studying hip hop and doing a film about hip hop and sort of continuing on with this kind of work about rap music and incorporating video into it, interviewing people and all of that same kind of stuff. And so even doing that project, I was always like, oh, it would be so, it was obviously influenced by DVS Mindz, but it would be interesting to go back to this project. And so I continued to stay in touch with the group over all the years. And ultimately in 2014, we decided, let's do this as a book project. This is after my first book came out. Let's do a book project. So I interviewed everybody in the group in 2014, for this book project. And since then, I've been interviewing them, every couple of years or something like that, and following their story. And here we are today. Ultimately wrote it into a book. So it took a long time to write the book, partly because I was working on a different book at the time. And, in part, the story has changed even as I was writing the book, because it's taking years and years. We ended up, sort of revising the ending, and the group reunites and all of these twists and turns. So, even we didn't kind of know how it was going to turn out in the end. But it's kind of amazing that it's here, this project that started, more than 20 years ago.
The DVS Mindz story is kind of set within a local hip hop scene, right? So you mentioned that they're from Topeka. Are you able to talk a little bit about what the kind of local Topeka hip hop scene looked like prior to DVS Mindz, or even just the Kansas kind of hip hop scene as a whole? Because there are some characters that are mentioned in the book, from like the Gucci guys, etc. Are you able to kind of talk about what that scene even looked like? Because I think most people, even if they're hip hop fans, are not really going to be aware of what's going on in Kansas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really the sort of idea of a micro scene, this small scene that's, sort of its own little bubble. But within that scene, it's, there's a whole world and all these interesting artists and things like that. But in the book, I detail a little bit of, the Gucci guys, who were this early hip hop group. And really, they started as a DJ group. They were mixing records together, and they had 4 turntables, and it was this sort of, DJ acrobatics. And then eventually some of the guys started to dance, and they were incorporating hip hop break dancers into it. And then some of the dancers started rapping, and so they incorporated rap into it, and eventually had this whole, full blown show with the DJs, the dancers, the rappers. And it was, like a renowned show. They played all around not just Topeka, but also Topeka is 20 miles from Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas has the University of Kansas, KU. That's 30,000 college students, and it has a renowned music scene. So there's a huge music scene in Lawrence. Even today, there's a big music scene, lots of venues, and then lots of students to go to those venues. So there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination in that Kansas scene, in that eastern Kansas scene.
You talk about the DVS Mindz guys opening up for You God, but prior to that, how did Well, I could ask how DVS Minds ended up kind of forming and getting together, but really, who is DVS Minds for the people listening at home? Who are these guys, and what is kind of their importance in that kind of local scene?
Well, in different parts of the United States, if you were to talk about, rap music coming from, let's say, South Central Los Angeles, you have to talk about NWA. If you talk about rap music in Kansas City, you have to talk about Tech Nine. He's sort of the page one. You would have to mention his name. Well, in Topeka, which is a smaller city, to me, DVS Mindz is the band that you have to mention if you're going to talk about rap music in Topeka, Kansas. In some ways, they were the sort of the founders. Now, certainly not the only rappers around. There were lots of other ones, and there are rappers who are mentioned in the book, who were pioneering this scene at the same time. But I would say that they were the band that, not only did they go the furthest, but they were sort of the biggest band on the scene. They were the band to beat even back then. They developed, they all lived in a house together and lived there and wrote music and, not recorded so much. A lot of it was performing. They learned how to perform because they didn't have a lot of recording equipment. And so they focused on their live show, and they became this sort of renowned live act. Everyone, not just in Topeka, but they began to get booked at opening for, some of the biggest acts around. And so when, one of Black Sheep or DOS Effects would come to town, well, who are we going to get to open? Oh, let's get DVS Mindz, because they were known to be a really reliable act that could just get the crowd going and also had this sort of local twist as well. So they became they formed in the early 90s and developed in the mid 90s. They spent a couple of years touring and trying to get a record deal, traveling all over the country, networking, going to conferences, doing whatever they could to try to, sort of get a major label deal. And when that didn't pan out, they decided to release their own independent label, own independent record on their own independent label. And this is around the time that I met the group. They were just about to release their debut album after all those years. And so that album came out, and it did get a lot of critical acclaim. They were nominated for awards for several years in a row, and they continued to be, opening for these major acts. Sort of the pinnacle of their career, and written about in the book, is their opening for the Wu-Tang Clan, which was this big show. Everybody's there, and they did an amazing job. It was an incredible performance. Unfortunately, the band, there was volatility within the group as well. There, part of what made them so great was that there was a volatility and electricity. And, like many bands like that, they weren't able to sort of sustain themselves. And so, they kind of drifted apart in 2002, 2003.
Got you. There's a fair amount of kind of the, let's say, the tail end of the book, or the last third of the book, that talks about what happens after DVS Mindz ends up breaking up, and the legacy and kind of the story that ends up continuing. What does end up what happens after that initial kind of collapse, let's say?
Well, and the book is structured in three parts. And so the first part begins with the childhoods of the four members of the group, and how the group formed, how they came to live together. The second part of the book is at their sort of artistic prime and in the heart of everything when I was there. And then part three comes, tells what happens afterwards. What happens from, let's say, 2003, 2004, when the group kind of breaks up, and what happens to the group, when they don't make it, when it kind of falls apart for them. And they go in very different directions. And should I spoil it and tell everybody what actually happens, or should I just say they go in very different directions and you almost have to read it to find out?
You could certainly spoil it a little bit. I don't think that ends up hurting. Yeah, feel free to spoil it a little
All
bit.
right, I'll spoil it a little bit. So they all go in very different directions. You know, Stu is the founder of the band, and he continues to make music. He's, the artistic, soul of the group in some ways. And for him, it's all about the music. And so he continues to make music and record music at just almost an incredible rate. And so he puts out, something like 12 albums in, 6 years or something like that, and just records and continues to sort of keep the musical, not so much the dream alive, but just continues on as an artist, decides that for what is important to him is the art and not necessarily the commerce or the commercialism. At the same time, because technology changes, and that's part of the story too, technology changes, and that allows him to then distribute his music to the world for free. And, maybe he doesn't make tons of money from it, but people listen to his music all over the world and they give him feedback. In some ways, his audience is much more significant than it was back then, and numerically. At the same time, Stu is an artist, and he talks about how, it's very different having listeners, who you never know or see listen to your music versus, the live experience that they were so known for, and having that face-to-face contact with their fans. I think he misses that in some ways. So he keeps I would say the dream alive, and then also kind of finds peace with a family. He raises a family, he has children, he gets married, and kind of finds a solid family life for himself. So that's Stu. Barry, who met Stu when they were 4 or 5 years old, and have been friends all of this time. He ultimately moves to Denver and takes up with another group of musicians there and continues to release music and record music, but has struggles and challenges along the way that are described in some detail in the book. And that becomes part of his story, but he still lives in Denver, the Denver area today. Damon, who had sort of always had a job, back when I met them, and had this sort of white collar job and was kind of a professional. Well, he ended up moving to Dallas and becoming a corporate trainer for Samsung, and working in the technology industry and in the phone industry. He has traveled the world. He's been to Argentina. He's been married for a long time, lives at a nice house, drives a really nice car. So he says that all of the things that he dreamed about getting in rap music, he ended up, getting by going this sort of other path. And so he pursued, sort of the more of might call it a traditional corporate path, and became very successful. What's interesting about him is that, his story certainly doesn't begin that way. It's quite a trajectory that he takes, from the beginning to there. So seeing that story unfold was amazing too, because he hadn't done any of that when I met him. He was just, sort of getting started on that path in some ways. So it was amazing to see how that turned out. And then Dewan had some real struggles along the way. He spent some years in prison, and that's detailed in the book. And obviously that comes with a lot of challenges, but he was sort of in and out of these institutions as a young person, and then also later in life, when he finally, does sort of, I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's quite an incredible twist right at the end. And to some degree, we all wondered if he was ever even going to live or walk again. But amazingly, he did come back from all of that. And, he's still recording music. He's out there recording music and all that stuff today. So their story has just been absolutely incredible. I mean, you couldn't even possibly make it up. And as I said, I watched it all unfold over 20 years too, which was amazing for me.
The book kind of celebrates this idea of a failed music career, and it takes seriously all the things that never really happened. What can the DVS Mindz story really tell us about failure? Because I think that's a important element of indie music, certainly underground rap, but it's not the story that typically gets told.
Right. Well, I think, there's two parts of it. One is that, I say in the book a little bit, I just touch on this slightly at the beginning, but even our stories of failure, these success stories, there's this narrative around failure now that failure is just great, that everybody should fail, that all the great startups, where the CEO was somebody who had a bunch of failed startups and then, figured it out. And, there's all this sort of narrative around, the CV of failures and, how failures, you learn from your failures. But what happens when when that's not the experience? In my own experience, failure is not always a great thing. Sometimes failure sucks, and sometimes failure doesn't lead to success, not necessarily. So, one is I'm sort of questioning this idea that, all failure is great and all failure is a stepping stone to success, because I feel like that's become the narrative. And in some ways that covers up, that allows a lot of failure to occur and to get sort of, brushed aside as, no, this is just stepping stones to success. Don't worry about your marginalized position. You're just on your way to great things. And I think not necessarily. So one is sort of questioning that idea. But then the other thing is, to what degree was their career actually a failure? Do they see it that way? I don't think that they necessarily do. They had some incredible moments. They achieved so many things. I think of, when I played music, we didn't get anywhere near what DVS Mindz accomplished. And, I still look back on that experience in some ways that are very positive. And I did learn some things, not necessarily from the failures of it, but maybe from the successes, from the creative parts of it. And I think it's the same for DVS Mindz. They had some incredible moments, some incredible highlights. And to just say that, because they didn't sell 10 million albums, that it somehow constitutes a failure, I don't agree with that. I don't think they agree with that either, So, they almost made it, but they sure did a lot of cool things along the way and had a lot of fun and have a lot of great memories. And, they accomplished a lot more than most. And now look at them. They have a book written about them and everything.
What do you think prevented them from, let's say, breaking out of the Kansas region? Because that is the book title.
I think that's tough. They could have, moved to New York or something like that. I think to some degree they were distinct because they were from Kansas. But at the time, maybe, that they had a lot of music that discussed, the Midwest and being from Kansas, but, maybe they could have even played that up more. Some of the songs like Central Time Zone, Check the Kids from Kansas. These are songs that didn't appear on their first album, even though, they were very rooted in that sort of identity. And so, perhaps they could have even emphasized that and played it up even more. But I think to some degree, they always got questioned, like there's rap music in Kansas, they have hip hop in Kansas. People almost couldn't believe it, that they were from Kansas. And so, I think it just, people didn't quite get it. They didn't understand that there could be a group from Kansas that was really good. I think now the idea of that sort of micro scenes, people understand that there's, great music taking place all over. And certainly, the way that people listen to music has changed a lot too.
This episode is brought to you by M&M's. Fun is everywhere, a universal language of smiles, laughter, and sharing. So embrace it with the iconic candy brand that has been built on bringing people together with its colorful, bite-sized chocolate candies. M&M's, available in milk chocolate, peanut butter, minis, and more. There's an M&M's flavor to suit everyone's taste. M&M's, for all fun kind. Visit MMS.com to buy now.
This episode is brought to you by the delicious and refreshingly bold fruit flavors of Mountain Dew. From the bold citrus kick of the original, be on alert for the kick of cherry flavor in Code Red, or charge your taste buds with raspberry flavor in Voltage. So reach for the satisfying taste that exhilarates. Do the Dew. Shop now wherever you conquer your thirst.
I think from just from the perspective of a hip hop fan and a hip hop kind of listener, I think the identity of Kansas plays some sort of role in this as well. Certainly, when I think of Kansas City hip hop or just Kansas hip hop, I think of Kansas City for one, and I am thinking about the names like Tech9 and what he ended up doing with Strange Music. And for those that are listening that are not familiar with really hip hop or what Strange Music is, it's a very alternative, experimental hip hop label that has kind of pushed the genre into kind of different territories and certainly represents a different sound than what DVS Mindz does. DVS Mindz would be a little bit more kind of street-oriented rap, whereas the Strange Music guys are distinctly not that. But when I think about the region, I am thinking about what Tech9 did and the Strange Music sound. And I think that has at least something to do with how I would kind of come at this and limit maybe my, I don't want to say expectations for DVS Mindz, but that's certainly not the term, but it would frame my going into that scene looking for a specific type of sound. And DVS Mindz is not necessarily that. Do you think that the kind of rise of Strange Music impacted their story at all? Or do you think it was always completely separate?
Well, yeah, Tech9 was around. Certainly when DVS Mindz got started at their first show, Tech9 was there, and already he was the headliner. So, you know, they were in a competition. He was not part of that competition. He was like a separate performer because he was that far along. Even already, he was ahead of them, and they were excited that they got to, you know, meet him and decipher with him because already he was making a lot of waves in Kansas City. So Tech9 was kind of always, you know, ahead of the game. But I would say that the Strange Music sound and that all the development of that in some ways came after DVS Mindz. I mean, Tech9 was certainly working on that and doing his thing. But, you know, he was, you know, when this book begins, he was just getting started with his career. He hadn't broken out nationally at that point. You know, his real development, I would say, came in the 2000s right as you know, DVS Mindz is kind of falling apart. So, you know, you know, Tech9 certainly was ascendant, but, you know, I think that everybody was looking for who was going to break out of the Midwest, you know, and Nelly also came out right around this time too and really exploded out of the other side of Missouri. And so everybody was looking for the big breakout artist from the Midwest. And I think, you know, you had Nelly, you had Tech9, you know, there was great stuff coming.
Saint Lunatics.
Exactly. Yeah. Stuff coming out of even, you know, some Chicago stuff kind of got lumped into that. So, yeah, I mean, Tech9, he is the, you know, the MC that you think of when you think of Kansas City rap for sure. There were also, you know, interesting rappers like Mac Lethal who were around, who had a, you know, incredible career and who, again, were just getting started as DVS Mindz, as I was, you know, meeting DVS Mindz. So, yeah, it was just neat that whole scene was amazing. There's so many great musicians, so much going on, you know. In some ways you don't know, you know, what you have until it's gone, because that was a very unique and special time.
So you had a relationship with DVS Mindz, not necessarily from the very beginning, but certainly over a 20-year period. For decades, you've had a kind of a steady relationship. You did the music video. You've done collaborative work. You wrote some of the articles for local publications in Topeka. When you sit down to write this book, you've already had that kind of past experience, that past knowledge. How much do you find yourself learning during the book process that you didn't necessarily know prior?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I learned so much. I thought I was the expert on DVS Mindz, and I learned so much from writing the book. And it began with, you know, I had shot probably 50 or so, maybe more hours of videotape, you know, back when I knew them in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. So I went back to all of the videotapes first, and I looked at every second of video. The shows, which I had seen, you know, I had seen the shows for sure. and had visited that footage before and posted some of it on YouTube before. So I was somewhat familiar with the shows, and I was familiar with the interviews from the documentary that we did, but there was so much more in that footage, in those tapes, that I didn't know was there. And then also I just learned so much by watching their shows and also listening to their music. Even though I had listened to their music for years and had always listened to their music, but I listened to it in a really new kind of way. And sort of listening to it maybe systematically. So thinking about, okay, they worked with this producer, SG. I want to listen to all the SG tracks, just the SG tracks and just the stuff that they recorded with SG. And that really just changed my thinking about the group and changed how, I understood their music. And that then changed how I looked at the live performances too. So I learned so much about them musically that I didn't know and thought that I did. And then also going through all of the interviews, I just found, so many things that I didn't expect. I found interviews that I didn't know I had. I had footage that I didn't know was there. I got lots of snippets of conversation that were going on at a party when somebody's talking in the background. But, there were just treasures and gems galore. And it was fun, a fun experience. In some ways, you couldn't, if you're a music geek, this is the ultimate experience to get to just do this complete deep dive into a band that, almost no one's ever heard of. It has been very fun to do that. And then also, Stu was amazing about providing me with some footage. So very key to the book. Stu got me a 1998 complete concert from 1998 at the Granada. This is, about a year before I met a group, and described the concert in the book. But it was very well shot, and it was so helpful to have that old footage. And then also they had provided me with about an hour of old footage when I did the documentary. So I had clips of performances. I had little pieces of them recording, at their house back in the day. I had footage of them on the road in Chicago and stuff like that. Not a lot, but still just enough to, really start to unpack it. So lots of cool stuff. And ultimately, that was at the heart of this sort of part two of the first couple of parts of the book, really. But part two, all of the interview quotes and all of that material comes just from the videotapes. I didn't want them to be, reflecting on that from 20 years, later with that vantage point. I wanted to capture them in the moment, what that was like, the electricity of that time. And then in part three, to have them maybe reflect on it more. So it was great to have that footage because I could put those sort of limitations around the project, and it almost made it better because of that limitation.
It's amazing. I do a lot of these interviews myself, and I think, like you, I tend to learn the most from the transcription process. I'm the one having the conversations with these artists. You would think that I would have an understanding of what that conversation really entails, but it seems like a month or two goes by, and maybe even immediately after the interview, if I sit down and transcribe it, there's all sorts of new kind of details that reveal themselves when you actually kind of revisit something and you take time to kind of analyze it and construct it. I'm always amazed by that because I think most people would assume that, oh, you've already done the interview. This is just for your own records, right? But no, you learn. It's such a learning process to be able to revisit that material and kind of look at it through different angles, like you were saying.
No, I think that's a great point. And I didn't even mention that. I should, because I did transcribe every single word of every interview from, back in the day, but also all these interviews that we did, subsequent to that time. It was over, I think it was 50 something hours of formal stuff, plus all the informal stuff. I transcribed all that too. So hanging out at parties and going through that, I agree with you 100%. I don't use, an outside transcription service. I don't, use chat bots or anything like that. I really have to sit there and do it by hand. And I feel like it allows me to understand the material in a way that I never could otherwise. And every time I go back to those interviews too, those transcriptions, it's like, ooh, here's something new that I hadn't, sort of thought about. And so even being able to revisit those transcriptions throughout the writing process, I think really is very, very key to it. So I've always done that in all my projects. I've done a lot of very, interview heavy projects. And for me, transcribing them myself is really sort of key to the process.
Yeah, really, really vital. So this is published through a university press. It's published through Columbia University Press, but the book deliberately kind of abstains from theoretical conversations. Why make that choice?
Well, that partially that came out of a conversation with the press themselves. Originally, I kind of had the thought that you have to do a theoretical treatment. And so the original book, as I conceived it, was to be the story of DVS Mindz, and then I will sort of impose a theoretical structure upon it and talk sort of theoretically about their story. So I did. I started by writing out the story of the band, kind of what you would see in the book today. And then I did add this theory to it, thinking about some ideas that I was developing and thinking about. And I sent this out to just a few presses, and Columbia liked it. They sent it out to the reviewers, and the reviewers everybody kind of liked the narrative and thought, this theory's really is going to need some work, and so you have to figure out what to do about this theory. It either has to be a lot better, or you have to pare it back or something. So my thought was, let's pare it back. Let's not do a real theoretical treatment, because it is the story of the band that's interesting. And, it was Eric Schwartz at Columbia was just amazing, so supportive of this project. And he said, I think you should, ultimately, he said, through a couple of meetings, you should just remove all of the theory. And of course, I'm going, all of it, 100%, and he's like, yeah, really, when you take it out, it just reads better if you just remove it completely and don't have it. And I'm going, but my great theory. But he was right. And, ultimately, what I did was I went back through that, manuscript. I took out all of the theory, 100% of it, and thinking, oh my God, how can I do this? And it was better, but also that freed me, because that was about 10,000 words of theory and jargon. And that freed me to do something that I think was so important. And that was go and interview some other people. And that was Randy, who I had interviewed back in the day, but I interviewed Randy, I interviewed Carla Daniels, I interviewed Troy, their first DJ, and I interviewed Steve Garcia. And I think having their voices in the book and just adding their stories just really, added something special to it for me and made the book so much better. So taking out that theory allowed me to add those voices in. I think, something that they said at the press is this is a great example of showing and not telling. And so I think that all of the theoretical ideas that I had, you probably could, still impose those theories and talk about these different things, but you can also just read it as a standalone book. And it can go on the music shelf and doesn't necessarily have to go on the sociology shelf. And, to me, ultimately, that made the book so much better. And it kind of freed the book in a way that it was very constrained before that by this theoretical apparatus that I had imposed upon it, because I thought that that's what you have to do when you're publishing with an academic press. Now, my first book, Chicago Hustle and Flow, I intentionally wanted to make that the most theoretical book about hip hop you could ever possibly read and still have it be a good book. And that's because I think that a lot of times, music studies don't get taken seriously, and hip hop studies definitely don't get taken seriously at all. And so I wanted to do a book that was undeniably theoretical and was just rooted in grounded in theory. And so that was intentionally done with Hustle and Flow. And so it was fun in this book to get to do something that went in the opposite direction. And even that came as a surprise to me. I didn't expect that the press, would go in that direction. And to me, that's what makes the book good. This would have been a pretty, hard book to unpack if it had been still weighted with all of that theory that kind of has nothing to do in some ways with the group or their story.
Yeah, the book almost reads it almost reads as biography, and maybe that's the genre that you would even place it within. How do you kind of classify this thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like that. It's funny when I had that sort of experience of liberation from the theory. I thought of a couple of books that I had read when I was a teenager. One of them was Hammer of the Gods by Led Zeppelin, and the other one was No One Here Gets Out Alive. I think it's Danny Sugarman, the biography of Jim Morrison. Now, I didn't go back and reread those books because I figured they probably wouldn't hold up, after all of these years. They're probably not that great. But I remembered the sort of spirit of those books and what I loved about them when I was a teenager. And that's that they had the sort of the myth and the legend of, those artists, and so, and DVS Mindz had these sort of moments of, they end up opening for the great band and, putting on the amazing performance. They, are brought in to write a song at the last minute, and they're able to, produce this incredible, song right there on the spot. They go and play the tiny club, and it's, they treat it like it's Madison Square Garden. You had these sort of moments, and even some of the moments of calamity and problems that they had, ranting on stage and things like that, overturning the table at the awards ceremony. So even some of these moments, the sort of reminded me in some ways of the spirit of those books. Those books, as I recall, and again, I didn't go back and read them, but I think they were kind of filled with sex and drugs, and there's not a lot of that in this book. But that sort of spirit of, here's the myth and what made them so great. For me, one thing to remember is that all of this does start with the fact that I just love their music, and from the first time I saw this band, I just thought this is one of the greatest bands I've ever seen. And I've been around music my whole life, and I just loved their music from the very beginning, and I still do. And so, for me, that's where it all kind of stems from, from that. And that was really driving. And in those books, you get that too, what made, Led Zeppelin so great, what made Jim Morrison so iconic. And part of that is the music, the shows, all of that kind of stuff. It reminded me in some ways of the DVS Mindz story. You get a lot of those same moments, even though this isn't the story of, the famous group or whatever. So I guess I was in some ways guided by those kind of books, even though I didn't go back and read them. And even I sent them to the cover designer and said, look at these books. I found the same editions that I had read when I was a teenager. And I said, see if you can do something, with these elements. And you do. If you go look at both of those books, you'll see some little hints of that in the cover design, which I just thought was so cool.
The book, and again, for those listening at home, it's called DVS Mindz, and that's spelled DBS, by the way, DVS Mindz, and then Mindz with a Z, or Z, and the subtitle, The 20-Year Saga of the Greatest Rap Group to Almost Make It Out of Kansas by Geoff Harkness. The book, for a hip hop fan, I see the appeal, right? Especially somebody that's into kind of indie or underground rap. And if you're particularly interested in something like Kansas City hip hop, or not Kansas City, but Kansas hip hop, it makes sense to have kind of a fascination. Someone like myself, I understand why I'm interested in a book like this. Why do you think other people should read this? What is the sales pitch for a book this specific, I guess?
Well, to me, it's a universal story. It's the opposite. This is a book about trying to achieve your dream and not achieving it. And what do you do after that? That happens to all of us. That to me, I felt very connected to this story because we've all experienced this same thing. What happens when you shoot for the moon and it doesn't work out? Do you adjust? How do you adjust? What comes after that? What moves do you make? To me, it's a very universal story, because we all have disappointments. We all have things that don't pan out the way that we want. And even our successes aren't necessarily like, oh, this is everything that I ever dreamed of. Sometimes you achieve a success and it's like, no, you see that story all the time too, So, to me, it's a very universal story. And also, although it is very much rooted in music, you also get their childhoods, you get, all of the stuff that came afterwards. So a lot of it's about music, but a lot of it's just about a life, and relationships and struggle. I also was, I was very sort of captivated by Stu's, story and sort of quest for a solid family, and a couple of the guys were adopted and things like that. So I really think that those elements, which are very much part of the book, are outside of music. So, to me, it's a real universal story about, trying to achieve your dreams and, struggling to do so. And then also, what do you do after that?
Beautiful. Well, Geoff, we've taken up a lot of your time. I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up, what is it that you're currently working on?
So I always have a bunch of things in the works. I just finished a really kind of a fun piece that I got to do right after the DVS Mindz book was done. It's music. It's about comic books and Kiss, the band Kiss, and it's for an academic book that's coming out. They're doing a sort of treatment of a bunch of different comic book heroes in the Marvel and DC universes, from all of these different perspectives. And so they came to me and said, "Do you want to do a piece for this?" And I thought, I don't really know anything about comics, and this is just not my realm. But I was like, oh, I'd love to write a thing about Kiss and Kiss comic books. So I got to do a deep dive into the history of Kiss and comic books, and they put their blood in the inkwell and stuff. So that's going to come out as a book chapter next year, and I'm looking forward to that. It's so fun to write and to research. And then I'm probably about halfway through the first draft on my fourth book. It is about music. I don't like to jinx it, so I won't say more than that. But I'll say that it's totally about music, and it's also in some ways a left turn. It's not about rap music either. Although I love rap music and hip hop scholarship too. That's by far not the only thing that I listen to, and I'm excited to get to write about some of this other stuff too.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, is there a lot of Kiss comic books? Was that a thing?
Well, yeah, you'll have to read the piece. But yeah, I mean, Kiss was approached by Marvel to do a comic book in the 1970s, and it was sort of a match made in heaven. And so Kiss, as always, thinking, how can we, make a show out of this? They, went to the Marvel printing press and had blood drawn by a nurse and poured into the inkwell. So their blood is literally in the red ink that was used for the first Kiss comic in, I think, 1977. So from then on, they got a lot of publicity, and from then on, they have had a relationship with Marvel and other comic book companies over many years. Yeah, it's a pretty wild story.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. It sounds like a great project. Yeah,
thank you,
Geoff. I wanted to thank you for being on the show today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. This was so fun to get to talk about this book after all this time. So I really appreciate the invitation and all your great questions too.
100%. Thank you so much, and take care.